let's talk really briefly here about some history in Cuba and CIA terror operations in Cuba. This is a document that you might have seen before. You might have heard of the CIA operation called Operation Northwood. You probably heard of this if you follow dirty US ops around the world and CIA ops. This was a false flag operation, as this really great academic Helen Yaffe has shown in this Twitter thread here. Now, of course, I had known about Operation Northwood, but it's really good to look at the documents themselves. I had never really done much research looking into the documents. Helen Yaffe is a professor, a lecturer at the University of Glasgow in the UK. She is one of the few academics that focuses on Latin America and on Cuba that is really good, that is very anti-imperialist, and has done excellent work on Cuba. So here she looks at this document, Operation Northwood. It's a false flag operation backed by the U.S. military and the CIA in 1962. This is just 3 years after the Cuban Revolution, in which they were going to carry out terror attacks on civilians, on civilian targets in Cuba, and also in the United States, by the way, and then blame that on Cuba and claim that the Cuban revolutionary government was responsible for these attacks, and then use that as justification for military intervention, for an invasion of Cuba. Here she looks at another document, proposes acts of terrorism to be carried out by the CIA and other U.S. agencies against U.S. targets and also Cuban targets, and both military and civilian targets, and then blaming them on the Cuban government. These are the classified documents right here. I mean, it's really incredible. Here's a quote. World opinion and the United Nations Forum should be favorably affected by developing the international image of the Cuban government as rash and irresponsible, and as an alarming and unpredictable threat to the peace of the Western Hemisphere. So we hear an example of the U.S. government admitting that it wants to carry out these terror attacks and then hurt Cuba's international image, claiming that Cuba is a crazy country that has to be isolated. Now, I want to read a brief part of this. It's really hard to read these documents because they're really grainy, so you're not going to be able to see it there. And honestly, if I get it up, you still might not be able to see it. But I just want to show, I'm going to read briefly part of this document on Operation Northwood. So these are the potential incidents, the potential terrorist attacks that the CIA and the U.S. military were discussing to carry out inside Cuba. Starting rumors, now that's common, capturing Cubans, capturing saboteurs, and it's really hard to read. This one is actually easier to read. Let me get up this document here. So and also this document is even more scandalous. Again, these are the tactics the U.S. discussed carrying out in both the U.S. and in Cuba, and blaming on Cuba. Blowing up ammunition inside the base, which starts fires. Burning aircraft on the airbase, sabotage. These are U.S. aircraft. So the U.S. was talking about burning its own aircraft and then blaming it on Cuba. Lobbing mortar shells from outside of the base into the base, causing damage to military installations. Capturing assault teams approaching from the sea. Capture a militia group which storms the base. Sabotaging a ship in the harbor, causing large fires. Sinking ships near the harbor. The United States would respond by executing offensive operations to secure water and power supplies, destroying Cuban artillery and mortar emplacements which threaten the base, which would then commence large-scale United States military operations. So discussing a, quote, remember the Maine incident, which could be arranged in several forms. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. We could blow up a drone, an unmanned vessel, anywhere in the Cuban waters. We could arrange to cause such an incident in the vicinity of Havana, the capital, or Santiago of Cuba, as a spectacular result of a Cuban attack from the air or sea or both. The presence of Cuban planes or ships merely investigating the intent of the vessel could be fairly compelling evidence that the ship was taken under attack. The nearness to the capital, Havana or Santiago, would add credibility, especially to those people that might have heard the blast or have seen the fire. The U.S. could then follow up with an air-sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighters to, quote, evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area or in Florida cities or even in Washington. This is the CIA admitting openly that they wanted to attack their own military base, their own civilians, and then use the media making fake casualty lists to spread fake news to make Americans angry, North Americans angry, so they could justify an invasion of Cuba. This is the CIA admitting openly that it does false flag attacks, that it kills civilians, or in some cases pretends to kill people and then falsely blames governments. If you think the U.S. hasn't done this since 1962, I'm sorry, you're high. You're extremely naive. This is exactly the kind of thing that the U.S. government does, that the CIA does. Here is Helen Yaffe points out other things. The Remember the Maine incident. They even have their own marketing for an operation they didn't even carry out. I mean, talk about cynical. Like they're talking about their marketing scheme for the media. Remember the Maine. It didn't even happen. But this is their plans to carry out these terror attacks and then blaming them on government. On the Cuban government. Them discussing a Cuban communist terror campaign in Miami or even in Washington. Hijacking attempts. Creating an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner, a civilian airliner in the United States. I mean, hijacking attempts against civilian aircraft. This is the terrorism the U.S. wanted to carry out. Now, why was it ultimately rejected? It was because of President Kennedy, JFK. He rejected it. It was 1 year before Bay of Pigs. Another president might have given the green light. That's, of course, why they took out JFK. It's worth remembering when you hear calls for humanitarian intervention in Cuba or any other country. This is the CIA playbook. The CIA and the U.S. military openly discussed, not openly, within their own circles, they privately discussed, but openly within Washington, discussed carrying out terror attacks in not just Cuba, but in the United States, in Florida, and blaming it on Cuba to justify a U.S. military invasion. Now, if you ever hear anything similar about Iran, China, Russia, about Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, don't believe it. In Syria, I mean, they still continue this with the white helmets and all this nonsense and the OPCW. It's very clear that they still continue carrying out these operations today, so don't fall for it.